What I'm going to present today is what we have been doing in Work Package 2. It's a big team, so if you could just raise your hand, who is on Work Package 2, he has to suffer with me for many years. We have Yuno over there, Eniko, Nora, Rebecca, a lot of people. They're still smiling, but it's probably because we're in public. So that's what I'm presenting. Everything that is good, it's because of them. Everything that you think is bad, that's because of me. So what we have been doing in this package is really looking at issue attention. So we're looking at what happened when an issue reached the public sphere or political agenda, and what kind of issues do we see, and how do they travel across time, what is their trajectory. So we look at it across 10 countries for a relatively long period of time, so from 2010 to 2022. In Brussels in December, more presented on party manifesto, so this time I'm going to focus more on issue trajectories. So what we know, and I think Louise did a really good job in showing that for reform parties, and we know that there is an expansion or explosion of alternative narrative on equality, and we know that a lot of parties who used not to talk at all about equality or women or sexuality actually now engage a lot on those topics. We know it's extremely volatile as well, and Louise really showed that with evolution in the UK, is that there is a lot of different themes that they pick. And that's why we actually try to understand in Work Package 2 is when do they select something and what happened. So here in this presentation, because it's actually a quite short one, I decided to look at when do attacks succeed. And I think it's first important to define what is success. And there's different type of success. So it could be a policy change. You can change a law, restrict access to something, but you can also veto a progressive change. That would be a success. You can occupy the space, take the agenda over. That is another kind of success. You can produce change in practices. The law doesn't change, but the practices, the way of implementing the law has changed. And you can have an impact on public opinion. You can increase the social stigma or reactivate social stigma. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to look at 4 situations. I'm not talking about conditions because I don't think we are yet at the stage to have discussion about real causality, but I'm going to talk about 4 situations that you can see when an attack against equality succeeds. The first one is permeable institution. I know we talk a lot about democratic erosion, but I think it's really important to look at how much institutions that are considered as strong are still permeable. And when we look at weak institutions, of course, everybody talks about Poland. But attacks do not only happen in Poland, and successful attacks do not only happen in Poland. If you look at the UK is one of the beacons of democracy. Recently, there has been a reinterpretation of the Equality Act, which has meant restriction in rights or protection for the transgender community. So we do have those kind of permeability of institutions because also regulatory frameworks are quite weak overall. Another situation where attacks are more successful is when there is a fragmented pushback, or when the counter-islands, the coalition that try to fight the attack is actually quite patchy. And we can see that very well in all the initiatives against the burqa in Europe. And this is a picture about Switzerland, where we had a popular initiative in 2021 that was accepted by a majority of the voters. And what happened is that somehow there were barely any women wearing a burqa in Switzerland. I think at the time it was less than 20 women in Switzerland wearing a burqa. So it was a non-issue, it just did not exist. But it was a problematization about immigration, about Islam, but what we saw as well is that the feminist movement struggled a lot to answer this popular initiative, and we did not really see a very strong coalition to fight against the burqa ban. A third situation is opinion, and I think Juno's presentation really showed really well that there is a lot of volatility in public opinion in attitudes toward equality. And if we think about what happened with transgender rights in the UK, and how can we explain that we somehow moved from a pretty inclusive society towards a society way more restrictive, or way more exclusionary of transgender people, well, what we can see is when we look at the polls, it's actually started already in 2020. So it's not something that Reform has problematized in 2024. They have picked something that was in the making for already quite a number of years. And this is something quite important because political parties do not like necessarily to talk about those issues. They are quite difficult for them to handle. So the parties who have the capacity to win election, they're going to be cautious in order not to engage in anything that they may lose voters. But parties who really want to make a space for themselves, they're going to be ambitious. And they're going to grab any issues that they see there is a potential among the public to actually be attraction for the platform. And we can see that for transgender, but we can also see some little movement for on abortion, for instance. When we ask, are you in favor or against abortion? There's no movement. But when we start to ask other questions about, are you in favor of extending the deadline for abortion, we can see that there is also there some movement, and we do not see a support as big as a general principle question, are you in favor of abortion? And finally, I think what is also really important is to keep in mind that no victory is possible. And the case of Italy and the current government in Italy is really interesting, because when Meloni got to power, it was a lot of anxiety about what was she gonna do against equality. And so far, there has not been much that was done, because actually there were not a lot of rights for LGBT community. But when we look a little bit further, she did two things really important. The first one, that they banned surrogacy abroad. So surrogacy is already banned in Italy, but now it's also banned for couples to go abroad to access surrogacy. That's a big win. It may look for us as a very small win, but actually it's a quite big one for them. The other thing that they managed to do is now to allow anti-abortion activism inside hospitals. The government is not banning abortion, but if we keep in mind that in the south of Italy it's already almost impossible to access abortion. When you go to central Italy or northern Italy, when you can get an abortion, what happens now is that you may, when you are inside the hospital, waiting for a consultation or waiting for your abortion, you may be in interaction with a pro-life organization or an anti-abortion organization. That is quite a win. Yes. And that is also something that really gives a fuel to the agenda, and it's a good fit. It really matches with the party of family, the party of conservative values. It does not necessarily have first to be big to have an impact and to be again for these parties. It actually can be quite limited, but it does feed the ideology behind. So when we look at, on the other side, what happened actually to push back, it's probably a way of thinking that in a way you push back, but you also have to push forwards. And the balance is not difficult, it's not always easy to strike. So it's, you have to push back against attacks, but you also have to keep pushing forwards equality. And when we look at what happened, I think really something really important is that attacks against LGBTQIA+ community are not separate against attacks against women's rights or gender equality. This is part of a broader agenda. This is all together. And I think when we look about women's rights, it would be, in my view, a mistake not to pay attention to what is happening against the LGBT community, because it's part of a broader movement. I think it's really important also to keep pushing for more comprehensive, more resilient frameworks. We hear quite a lot these days that there are enough laws. We don't need more laws on equality, we need to implement them. That's partly true, but we also need to make sure that the legal frameworks that we have right now are actually strong enough to counter any attacks. And I think, again, the case of the UK for the Equality Act is very telling of this situation. The Equality Act is not a bad act. It's a pretty comprehensive legal framework. It has brought a lot of positive changes, but it's obviously not comprehensive to be resilient enough to resist contestation via court. I think it's really also important to do venue shopping, and what I mean by venue shopping is to keep going through different venues in order to try to counter the attack, but also to make further gains. The courts have become a pivotal actor in Europe. It's not just in the US, it's not just the US Supreme Court. Courts have been very important in Europe to give, to push toward more progress, but also this day sometimes to block progress or to regress. It's important to keep monitoring the implementation of the framework. I think it's really important to keep engaging with parties across the board. We can see that some parties are trying discreetly to move out of the gender LGBT debate. They try to shut it down because they don't want to get involved. But somehow it is important to keep engaging political parties about it so that those issues stay on their priority list. And probably there is still something to do about the equality coalition. And it has to be stronger, but to be stronger, it has to be broader. And I think now probably it's really time to have those conversations about what it means to be in favor of equality and what it means to have intersectional equality or inclusive equality. It may be difficult conversations, but I think those conversations need to take place, and very, very soon, because somehow as long as the entire coalition for equality is not more cohesive, it's going to be difficult to resist the attacks. And finally, I think engaging with public opinion is extremely important. We have seen public opinion is extremely volatile at the moment on those kind of issues. And somehow there is the need for a broader, more diversified and a clear messaging. And I think this is where anti-gender equality are extremely strong, is that they are making the best of social media capacity. When you look at what pro-equality are doing, they are kind of slowly but surely withdrawing from social media or selecting some very specific type of medium versus others. That's a question for debate. Is it really the right strategy when actually part of the social media sphere is completely occupied by anti-gender and anti-equality, and other parts is completely absent? That's it.